Hey there everybody, Evan here with Sea Goddess Whale Watching for another one of our fun videos. This time we're going to be doing something a little different. Instead of giving you a nice background on some of the whales we have here in the bay, we're actually going to be doing frequently asked questions when we're out on tours. What are the difference between whales and dolphins? And that's a very good question. A lot of people can get confused with that. Whales being associated with the larger baleen whales that everyone is used to seeing, like the blue whales, the humpbacks, and the grays. Those are usually the baleen whales, which have that. Instead of teeth, they have something called baleen that comes down in their mouth. It's like a fibrous brush. And to tell them apart, they are usually much larger, but you will also notice that between them and the dolphins are usually much smaller, have a more pronounced dorsal fin, and they usually have a nice pronounced beak as well. And those are the easy ways to tell them apart. They usually are a little bit skinnier when they're dolphins as well. How many species of whales are there? Now that's a good question because we actually do have two separate groupings for whales. We have the toothed whales, which are the odontocetes, and those are going to include the orcas, you have the dolphins, the sperm whales, and there are in fact 67 different species of those. And then we have the baleen whales or the mysticetes, in which there's 11 species, and that includes the humpback, the grays, the blues, and other whales including in there too. Now for our next question we have, how do whales communicate with each other? Another very fun question to answer because it's a little bit tedious. The scientists don't really know too well how they communicate. It's thought to be very tonal, vocalizations underwater, and that's what you hear when they come to the surface as well. They do make a couple of higher pitched noises depending on the species, and that is thought to be an interplay between those whales communicating with each other when they're nearby. What are the different fins on a whale used for? Now for each fin it does have its own specific function. A couple of them, like the dorsal fin, is much more prominent in dolphins than it is in the larger whales like the humpback and the blue whale. And it's believed, for the dolphins at least, that it's a way for them to regulate their body temperature. It is very vascularized, so when they bring it out of the water it can allow them to gain or lose heat very effectively. The other fins that we're going to be talking about are the pectoral fins, which are those large front flippers that you see on the dolphins and the whales. Those are mainly used for locomotion, so it allows them to move forward, to direct themselves where they are in the water and where they want to go, and sometimes even move backwards if they're able to use those effectively. And then lastly, the most important one is going to be the caudal fin or the tail fin, which is in the back. And so for the humpback whales and all the rest of them, obviously that is their source of momentum, but at the same time, especially leading into the larger animals like those humpbacks, it can also be a way of defense because that's obviously a very muscular tail. How do dolphins see underwater? Now that is another very good question, and it's actually kind of twofold. They have eyes, obviously, like other marine mammals. However, as you can imagine, when underwater, your eyesight only does so much for you, especially when you start getting deeper down in the water column. So they actually use and employ a very interesting technique called echolocation, and that actually allows them to visualize animals, prey, and their surroundings with sound instead of eyesight, which can travel much farther and much faster and travel back to them and give them a perfect picture of what they're looking at without even having to see it with their eyes. How do whales hear? Now that is a little bit of an interesting point compared to humans, and that being said, humans, your ear bone is connected inside your skull with the rest of your skull. And so what happens that's different with the whales is, being underwater, humans have a hard time discerning where sound is actually coming from. And so the way animals like these marine mammals have discerned a way to do that is they actually have separated the ear bones from the skull itself, so that way the entire skull does not vibrate when the sound hits them inside the water. There is also a secondary membrane called the basilar membrane within the ear that vibrates and allows them to pick up frequencies much more effectively underwater. Do whales have a sense of smell? Now that is a little bit of a point of contention. There hasn't been a ton of in-depth scientific research on that point so far, but they have seen from recent studies when a whale washes up on shore and they do a necropsy and kind of dig around inside the whale after it's died, they have noticed that a lot of them, specifically the toothed whales being the orcas and dolphins, that they actually seem to be missing a fair amount of those sensory organs relating to sense of smell. And when they did studies on the baleen whales in that regard, they did find some of the organs, but they were far reduced, leading to the belief that they do not have a very good sense of smell. Do whales sneeze? Now, the answer to this is more of a yes and a no. They do in fact have something very similar to a sneeze, but it cannot actually be categorized as a sneeze itself. When you categorize something as a sneeze, it basically means you are involuntarily exhaling air. Basically, anyone who sneezed before knows that you don't really have much control over when it's going to happen or not. Whales are in fact voluntary breathers, meaning they're completely conscious of when they're breathing all the time, unlike humans. And so in doing so, they cannot physically sneeze because that means they would have to not have control for a certain point. So they do, in fact, do something very similar where they exhale air out to dislodge something from their nasal passage, but they do not, in fact, sneeze like humans do. I've heard the word trumpeting. What is it? Well, that is actually a very interesting and good point because we do hear that a fair amount on a lot of our tours that we have out there. Trumpeting is something that happens at the surface of the water. The whale will come up to breathe, and as it breathes and it exhales, you will actually hear a pretty high pitch, almost like a whining noise. And that can actually vary. It can be through higher and a little bit of a lower pitch. And it's believed to be a sort of emotional response. It can be something where the whale is believed to be communicating, but scientists do not know if it's actually conveying an emotional response or if it's simply trying to talk to its pod mates. Do whales have hair? They do in fact have hair, albeit it's in very small amounts. For the most part, whales don't, especially when they're adult, just because hair is not very good of an insulator when in water, and at the same time it produces a lot of drag in the water as well, so it actually would be slowing the whale down. The times that you're going to be seeing a lot of hair, or at least a small amount of hair on these animals, is when they're first born, and the likelihood of that is just because when they're first born, they're not going to be born with very much blubber, and if they're born in waters that are not very warm or close to their ambient body temperature, they're going to need some sort of insulation before they get that blubber store ready to go, and so hair would be a great way to do that. What is baleen? Now baleen is something that is very important, especially to the mysticetes, who are the ones that actually have the baleen in their mouths, and the mysticetes, remember, are in fact the baleen whales. Now what baleen is it's actually made of keratin, very much like our hair and fingernails, and what it is it basically acts as a sieve. It's going to look like a giant hairbrush in the mouth of these whales, and what they'll do is they'll open their mouth, water will come flooding in with food, krill, plankton, whatever it may be that they're trying to eat. They will then close their mouth, use their tongue to push the water out against this baleen. The baleen will allow the water to leave, but it will keep the food source inside their mouth that they can then scoop off and swallow. So it acts very much as a sieve. They trap in their food and let the water go so they do not have to ingest a bunch of seawater. Alright everyone, thanks again. We really have had a great time here. Unfortunately, we don't have any more times for questions today, but we will have a couple more installments of these, so we look forward to seeing you soon. Please do check in with us as well if you have any questions about anything for these whales regarding dolphins that we did not actually address here today. Check out our social media sites. You can leave us a post, ask us a question, and we'll see if we can work it in on some of the next videos. Hope to see you out on the whale watching boat soon. Thanks again.